Good. All right. Good evening, everyone, or late afternoon by the Jewish clock. We are beginning chapter 3 in Ketubot this week, and we are doing a slight digression, because, that's what happens in Jewish learning, but we're going to be looking at a topic which may be uncomfortable to some. We are going to be looking at the topic of rape and at the topic of inappropriate seduction. That is to say, a seduction of somebody who is single to the point of leading to intimacy when it was not appropriate, meaning that there had not been an agreement for marriage and other such normal nuptials. And both of these topics are covered in the Torah, as are the implications for what happens when these things in the Torah. But of course, the Torah needs further explanation, and that's what our Mishnah is going to be discussing. But it's just important to recognize that even though the Mishnah is going to treat these topics as though they were sort of matter of fact, this does not mean that they were approved or accepted behaviors within the community. It's simply one of the other instances that we see where, since this has already happened, how will we actually handle it in our community in order to be compliant with the Torah? The same way that if we talk about somebody who murders someone else, the Mishnah doesn't bother telling us that murder is wrong. The Mishnah knows that we know murder is wrong. It's simply going to tell us how to deal with a person after murder has taken place. So too in these two cases of rape, as well as the unlawful seduction of a woman. So with that as a warning and as a reminder that indeed our tradition hates both of those activities, we're going to dive into the details. Good? Okay. So we're going to dip into our introduction this week. Normally we don't bother, but since this is a topic that I think a lot of people skim and don't pay much attention to in the Torah, I'm very grateful that the United Synagogue translation includes the reference in the Torah for us. One of the handouts. So we're in Deuteronomy 22, verses 28 and 29. And I'm going to go ahead and just read the verses from the Torah. If a man comes upon a young girl, a virgin, who is not engaged, and he seizes her and lies with her, and they are discovered, the man who lay with her shall pay the girl's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife. Because he has violated her, he can never have the right to divorce her. Okay, probably sounds a little unusual. Probably sounds like maybe not exactly the rule you would have picked for how you deal with this kind of rape in the modern world. So let's just take a couple pieces of this, and then we're going to get into the actual Mishnah's handling of it to make sure we understand the situation. So first of all, why is it pointing out that she was not engaged? Right, would it make a difference if he was raping an engaged girl? Absolutely. No, not in the price. If she's already engaged, she's basically someone else's wife. He has now committed adultery, and now he has the death sentence for him. Right? If you rape another person's wife, you die. So the fact that she is not engaged is absolutely essential in this particular case. The fact that she's not
about it's less of a property issue. It's like, well, we care less about the individual and more about if she's someone's property.
No, because a woman never becomes the property of her husband in Judaism. Right? A husband can't sell his wife. A husband can't rent his wife or anything like that. But a woman who is married is then bound, as is the husband, in Kiddushin, in a holy bond. And for a person to improperly benefit from something that has been sanctified is considered to be a big problem. The same way that if I dedicate a cow to the temple, if someone else comes and eats my cow, it's different than if they just eat my cow. Because it was dedicated. It's not because it's my property, but because of the holiness that has been attached to it in that special bond. And the holiness of two people who are married is considered one of the highest levels of holiness. So adultery is considered one of the greatest crimes that a person could commit. And the fact that she is not engaged also means that we have to discuss the social structure of the ancient world. And we've talked about this a little bit, but it really bears repeating. If you were a woman in the ancient world, that meant that you were dependent, because of the way the economy was divided, upon some person, meaning a man, who had inherited land. Yes, there were rare exceptions of women who were independently able to support themselves, but the vast majority were dependent upon the people who had inherited land, meaning men, because the land had been allocated according to the tribes in the time of Joshua, etc., etc., back to the beginning. That meant that if you're a woman, your basic economic livelihood, because 95% of the world were farmers, was dependent upon someone who had land to farm. When you were born, that was your father. And when you got married, that became your husband. Making sense? So when we have the father being involved in this situation, that's because the father is involved in the situation. She is not off handling her own business and then gets raped and suddenly they're sending money to her dad. She is living with her father at the time when this happens. Question?
Yeah, but we learned that a woman can refuse to marry someone.
Absolutely,
So,
yes.
But here say that she needs to marry him and he cannot divorce her. So it's like.
So first of all,
can she refuse to marry him?
Yes.
And B, can she divorce him?
Not exactly for B. So yes, she can refuse to marry him, and the father can also refuse to accept the betrothal on his daughter's behalf. But she is within her rights to refuse to get married to this guy after the fact. However, the penalty is still the same. He still has to pay the price, which what's that? The 50 shekels. What we're going to see is not only the 50 shekels. That's a bonus penalty that he is paying. But as far as her initiating a divorce, Jewish law says that divorce is initiated by the husband. And that is, in fact, why this law was written the way it was in the Torah, was to make sure that he couldn't simply dispose of her after he had married her in order to satisfy the legal requirement. Because then she would not be in her father's house. I mean, perhaps she might be able to make her way back to her father's house and become part of it again, but maybe not if the guy had moved. But it also meant that he would be obligated to take care of her, because marriage was not just about a romantic institution. Marriage was very much about an economic dependency on each other. And so for him to not be able to divorce her is the equivalent of saying he has to pay for her upkeep for the rest of her life, and he can never get out of that. And that was because if she went along with it, this would give her the financial security that he had put in jeopardy by having raped her. Because as much as we may hope that people will not look with any sort of stigma or maltreatment of somebody who has been raped, we know from our earlier chapters of Ketubot that the law says there shouldn't, and people in a community can still behave badly. And so the Torah is trying to protect her from the rest of the community saying, well, she got raped, I'm not sure if I'm saying, no. He has to take care of her forever.
But she must live with him or not? For example, can he pay all her life and money like for his deed, but she can go back to the dad's house without living with him?
Yes and no. So yes, they can be separate, but no, in the sense that was not encouraged. The idea was meant to be, of course, that both men and women would be together because that was good for both of them. That there was supposed to be intimacy for both of their sake, and of course there was supposed to also be children for both of their sake. So it would not be highly encouraged for them to live apart. Technically, yes, that was something that could happen, but it was not the normal situation. Obviously, this is, of course, not a normal situation either.
It said that they were betrothed, the only penalty is the death penalty, right?
If she was
betrothed,
right.
Yeah. But
Betrothed or married, yeah.
Or married. But it seems like that would almost let the guy get off almost free, because chances are they wouldn't be able to meet that from an evidentiary point of view.
Apart from being killed?
Well, they wouldn't be able to kill him because they wouldn't be able to meet the evidentiary burden.
Then if he was not convicted of adultery, but he was still convicted of rape, then it would be go back into the how can you convict someone of rape but not convict them of murder?
Well,
adultery.
My understanding is to convict somebody of crime punishable by death, it had to be witnessed by two people who
Every
warned
crime.
them, acknowledged the
Every
warning.
crime had to be witnessed by two.
Was adultery a crime or was it civil?
There was no distinction.
All right.
We're talking about the Torah here. That didn't say civil crime and non-civil crime.
So for this to kick in,
But who were the witnesses if it's
that's the
just
problem.
them?
That's why you couldn't convict them.
Well, so who were the witnesses if it was just them? This is in fact where the Torah's other laws about rape legislation becomes very powerful, which is to say that if he rapes her in a place where there are no witnesses, it is her word against his, and her word is believed. So she absolutely has the upper hand for holding him accountable for this deed. If he raped her in a place where there was no help, and if he raped her in a place where there was help, then help should have come. If help didn't come and it was clear that she was still raped, then he is still also in trouble.
But they can't execute him off just for a word, though, right?
No, but they can definitely charge him with the rape, which means that the other penalties would apply.
What were the other penalties?
The ones that we're talking about here, as well as others that we'll get into when we get the rest of the Mishnah actually out, because we haven't got past the introduction.
Different sentence, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
but why they don't use a different part of the Torah? They can use what happened with the rape of Dinah, that they killed everyone. So maybe they can use that Torah. Not really. To rape someone is a death sentence.
Right, but it isn't.
Huh?
But it isn't. God did not command that Shimon and Levi kill the people of Shem. We can't use that as a legal mitzvah. We can talk about whether they did right or whether they did wrong and all of that, and that's great for a sermon. But as far as law, you can't apply the law from that precedent. The same way that we don't apply law from Judah and Tamar and what they did. We only can say when the Torah says you will or you won't, that is where we have a mitzvah that we can turn into a law. This is why, for example, Rashi asks, why didn't the Torah begin with the laws of Passover? Why bother with Bereshit? The whole book of Bereshit seems pointless because there are no mitzvot. I mean, fine, yes, we have the Gid HaNashe, the sciatic nerve, we have circumcision.
The reproduction.
What's that? And we have be fruitful and multiply. Okay, so we give 3 sentences, and then we get into the actual important stuff. But that's because the other stuff prior to the giving of the Torah is not legally relevant. It's very informative, it's very persuasive emotionally, but it's not law. It's like the preamble of the Constitution doesn't count as something that is held up in the court as being, this is what it is.
So in a discussion about the topic in the Mishnah and Gemara, you cannot use any Mount Sinai argument as a counter argument.
You can use it as a reference for context, but you can't use it to establish a commandment or to overturn where we have an explicit commandment. And here the explicit commandment is, if he rapes her, he's paying and probably marrying forever. So that's the basic structure. Now, you're gonna have to hold on with me, but there's a very also narrow window in which point.
I'm sorry, I'm still not past the first sentence. If rape implies that there's no consent
Correct.
on one side, so why would it ever be what she wants to marry this guy if she didn't want to?
Doesn't have to.
No, but she's asking under what circumstances would she want to, right? So it would be in some communities to her economic benefit to say, look, now that he's raped me, my economic prospects are diminished. Now I can hope that I'll meet a nice guy that is not going to have this issue.
A trauma that you're living with the rest of your life. I don't understand who came up with, oh, this is a good idea to have this be the law.
So it was both for her economic benefit, less than for her emotional. The penalty that's paid is for her emotional benefit and for her economic short-term benefit. But for her long-term benefit, the only way to be able to get him to support was to bind them together. We didn't have bank accounts or wages to garnish or things like that. So the only way to make sure he was legally responsible for taking care of her was to use the instrument of marriage in the ancient world. Additionally, this was also meant as a deterrent. which is to say that for a man to think, oh, I can just run around and rape women and do whatever I feel like, and okay, fine, maybe if I'm wealthy, I can just pay them off and it's okay. Like, no, you rape her, you're married to her, right? Whatever you do with that part of you, you better be thinking, do I want to be married to her forever? Which, by the way, is good advice in the modern world too, even if we don't apply this law. If you're not willing to wake up next to this person for the rest of your life, you probably shouldn't be sleeping with them even once. And that is a remarkably good psychological deterrent. Does that mean rape is still not going to happen? Unfortunately, it will still happen because there are always some people that can't think long term, which is also why our commentators point out why he has an immediate penalty in addition to the marriage, because the immediate penalty may be more persuasive for people that are impulsive. Right? If I know that there's I'm going to get points on my insurance, that may discourage some bad drivers. But if I know I'm going to get a $500 fine tomorrow, that may discourage different drivers. And hopefully between the short-term fine and the long-term responsibility, we can discourage almost all of the reckless drivers. And that's what's going on here. All right, so there's going to be another timeline issue we need to come up with, but I think we're going to get some Mishnah on the table, and we'll come back to that timeline topic when it appears in the Mishnah itself. All right.
Mishnah 1.
Mishnah 1.
These are the girls to whom the fine is due. If one had intercourse with a Mamzeret, a Netina, or Samaritan.
Okay, wait. The fine is only due to some girls who were raped, not all of them? What the Mishnah is doing here is going back to our state and saying that she shall be his wife, which is to say, you would think that the fine would only be applicable if he can marry her, meaning that she is available to be married according to Jewish law to him. But what this is saying is that there are certain women to whom he wouldn't normally be able to get married, but nevertheless, he still has to pay the fine. So a mamzeret, generally speaking, he wouldn't be allowed to marry her, but he is still going to pay a fine if he rapes her. He can't marry her.
Why not extra fine? Because we're too cheap.
Because
why not extra fine? Because you know what? Those people cannot marry him. That is for you that the logic, economical reason. Right. So you know what? So because you cannot, you don't need to pay the rest of the life. Instead of 50, you need to pay 180.
Because that's not what the Torah itself says. Right? Remember, the rabbis are not trying to create law out of nothing. The rabbis are trying to interpret the text of the Torah that we have. And yes, they are willing to interpret, sometimes it seems almost a stretch, in order to fulfill some of the elements that we might consider justice or mercy or compassion. But there's only so much they can do with the text that we have. And we have to believe that the text we have is meant to cover the issues. Now, I do want to allay your fears again, that we're talking about the question of fine, but we're not talking about the question of the other damages that he has to pay. And we are going to cover those other damages if we get there. Okay, so the mamzeret, the netina, the Samaritan, he does still have to pay a fine for.
Or with a convert, a captive, or a slave woman, who was redeemed, converted, or freed.
That's respectively, right? A convert who was converted, a captive who was redeemed, a slave woman who was freed. Right? It's not all three of those verbs happening to one person. If she was under the age of 3 years and 1 day. So you may remember from our very first chapter of the Mishnah Ketubot, this is talking about the idea in the ancient rabbinic community that if a girl had been violated under the age of 3.5, her sign of virginity was considered to have reappeared by the time she was of marrying age. And therefore she was re-virginized, if you will. And that meant that she would then be considered a virgin when he raped her. We got that? And remember, again, the virginity was a very important economic marker in the ancient world, and that's why it was considered to be a special fine for having raped the virgin. It's, again, not to say that if you rape a non-virgin, you get away with it. It was simply in the case of a virgin that there was a special economic penalty that was being compensated for by this fine. All right, so if in those cases, again, yes, there is a fine that is being paid, even though the going assumption in the ancient world was that if a girl was not born Jewish and she came after she was the age 3.5, she wasn't a virgin, because we all know what those pagans were like, right? They were all over each other. And the same thing with a woman who had been taken as a captive. We know that the captors rape the women that they take, including the girls. And also the case of a slave, we know that how slaves are treated, that she certainly would no longer be a virgin. However, if it happened before she was 3.5, then she is considered legally a virgin for the purposes of this law.
I think that's a question. When you say a slave woman, you meant a slave owned by a non-Jewish person, right?
There was even concern that slaves owned by other Jewish people were treated in licentious ways by either their masters or by each other, by the other slaves. Yes. Part 3.
If one had intercourse with his sister, with the sister of his father, with the sister of his mother, with the sister of his wife, or with the wife of his brother, with the wife of the brother of his father, or with a woman during menstruation, he has to pay the fine. For although these are punishable through carrot, there is not, with regard to them, a death penalty inflicted by them.
All right, so again, all of those women he wouldn't be allowed to marry.
Is that the penalty? I remember the Torah, all those.
Nope. We're going to actually see on the next page the ones that have the death penalty. This particular category is by karet, right? If you sleep with your aunt, the penalty is not death, the penalty is karet.
Which is?
Karet is the technical term for spiritual death, meaning that your soul is sent to oblivion. Does it actually say at the bottom?
Yeah. What's this punishment
Inflicted by God and not by the court, which is a euphemism, exactly.
Is that the same word when they say like your soul is like cut off?
Exactly. When you see many translations and say so-and-so will be cut off, that's karet in the Hebrew. But cut off doesn't have the right connotation in English, so a lot of translations won't bother translating it because it doesn't really fit. Okay, so in all of those cases, he does still pay the fine, as well as all the other penalties that go along with having raped. But this is the question of the fine, which is unique to the case of a virgin who isn't engaged or married. Good. Well, not good, but hopefully we understand. Mishnah.
He doesn't have to marry them?
What?
He doesn't have to marry any of them?
Well, he can't marry them. And that's what the rabbis are trying to make sure, that he didn't find a loophole. Just because he's not allowed to marry these people. You can't marry your sister. But that doesn't mean that you don't end up paying a fine.
What's the name that the one of the kings that raped the sister?
You're thinking of Tamar and the other one.
Yes. Did he pay a fee? I can't remember.
No. He got up. He did not.
And that's after Mount Sinai.
Well, no, it was a huge problem. That was part of the flaws of King David's court. I mean, his children. It was terrible, but that was partly the leftover effect because of what he did when he committed adultery with Bathsheba. So yeah, that I'm going to be. What was
Avshalom?
No.
Avshalom was the one who killed him in revenge for what he had done. And it was Adoniah who tried to take over the kingship when David was almost dead. Who was the one who raped Tamar? No. Adoniah was the one who tried to get Solomon out of the way at the end of David's life. It was one of his other sons. None of them were good. He had 3 rotten sons, and it was really, really bad. Okay, 3-2.
And in the following cases, there is no fine. If a man had intercourse with a female convert, a female captive, or a slave woman who was redeemed, converted, or free after the age of 3 and a day.
All right, so again, because all 3 of those people would be presumed to no longer be virgins, then you do pay the normal penalty for having committed rape, but you don't have to pay the additional 50 shekel fine, because the assumption is their virginity was taken under those circumstances. But part A,
Rabbi Judah says a female captive who was redeemed is considered to be in her state of holiness,
meaning a virgin,
even if she is of majority age.
All right, so Rabbi Yehuda tries to say, no. Just because she was taken captive doesn't mean that we think her virginity is gone. He loses that argument, right? According to the majority opinion, no, we know what captors do when they take someone captive, and that is just the unfortunate way of the ancient world. Part two is going to sound familiar, but now the flip side.
A man who had intercourse with his daughter, his daughter's daughter, his son's daughter, his wife's daughter, her son's daughter, her daughter's daughter, does not pay a fine because he forfeits his life for his death in the hands of the court, and he who forfeits his life pays no monetary fine, for it is said, and yet no other damage ensues, he shall be fined.
Okay, so we'll come to the explanation of where they derived this from in a second, but I want to make sure we get the basic principle, which is if you're guilty of a crime, and the punishment for that crime is death and a monetary fine, you don't have to pay the monetary fine. You get executed instead, right? You only have one punishment, which is death. And they're deriving this from the text that we actually discussed this last week when talking about abortion in the nutshell. They're deriving this from the idea that it says, and no other harm happened, then he pays a fine, which implies if other harm happened, then you wouldn't pay the fine. So they're saying it's one or the other. If the person lives, then you pay a fine. If the person dies, you die. You're executed for the crime. In fact, they go so far as to say, even if you wouldn't be executed, if the crime was one that normally could involve execution, you still don't pay the fine. You take the other punishments as they are meted out. Following that logic? Okay, only one penalty.
But then, if they decided to do the fine instead of the death because they had insufficient evidence, didn't we say the fine goes to the woman's father or the woman directly?
It depends on some details of the circumstance, which we will eventually cover. But in general, it would go to the father as a rule, but then they're going to find exceptions to that.
But if it's your daughter, then it would go to the woman directly because the father can't pay a fine to himself. Right?
Correct, right. If a man rapes his own daughter, he doesn't pay himself a fine. That wouldn't really be a punishment.
So we pay
Take it from this pocket and move it to that.
So we pay to the court.
No, pay to her.
And to her, but
To her.
her money is also go to him.
Well,
So
he'll be
directly go back to him.
but he'll be dead soon, so that's not really an issue. Actually, if he's going to die, then he's not paying the fine. But yes, she is considered separate from him now. It does not go to him.
Okay.
It's not like found money, like, you know, if she finds a dollar bill that it goes to the parent. It would stay hers.
Can he manipulate her with it to say, oh, remember that money that I pay you, so now you use that money. No.
For his daughter?
No.
He raped his daughter. He didn't marry her.
No,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. 3-3. If you're willing to read, otherwise you just say pass, and the next person picks up reading in your place.
In the chapter that describes rape in Deuteronomy.
Go ahead and just pick up where it says Mishnah 3. We don't need to read. No, you're on the right page. Yep,
Okay.
but go to the middle where it says Mishnah
A
3.
girl was betrothed and then divorced. Rabbi Yosef the Galilean says she does not receive a fine.
Go ahead and read Rabbi Akiva 2.
Rabbi, I'm just trying to process. I don't even.
Well, that's why I tried to explain once we said it.
Rabbi Akiva says she receives the fine and the fine belongs to her.
Okay, so the question is, you have a girl and she got engaged, but then she was divorced, and then she was raped. Right, so that's our timeline. She was engaged, but then divorced, and then raped. But because she was divorced before they finalized the marriage, she is still a virgin. But the question is, does the fine go? Does she receive a penalty? Does she receive a fine at all? And then the question would also be, does she receive the fine, or does her father receive the fine? And the answer that is being held, well, Rabbi Yossi says, no, because she was engaged and divorced women are automatically considered to be out of the category of virgins, therefore she doesn't get the fine. But Rabbi Akiva, whom the halacha follows, says, no, she does receive the fine, and since she is a divorcee, she is not considered part of her father's household automatically, therefore the money comes to her directly. Following that? Okay. Yeah, that was a short one.
So what happened when there was a difference of opinion like that? Then what would happen?
Well, that's partly why we have the Talmud, is to resolve the differences of opinion. But there's also a general set of rules that we use to process. Of if so-and-so and so-and-so are arguing, then we know the first guy usually wins, unless it's one of the few exception cases. So there's sort of a general rule of thumb for handling most of these. Minority versus majority, the majority always wins. And that is further driven home by how the Talmud discusses it.
I thought the Talmud, a lot of times I've noticed they put the people who don't win first because it will give so-and-so's opinion and it says, but the sages say.
Oftentimes, yes, but it's not. That's not the iron rule. Good.
Good.
Okay. Oh, sorry. We need an introduction. Here we need another introduction because I forgot we were changing topics. So we are now moving into the topic of seduction. Now, seduction here does not mean, meeting someone on J-date, going out and, hanging out together and, getting to know each other and then you decide to get married. That's not seduction. Right? Seduction is a specific series of events that lead to intimacy before marriage. It is the taking advantage of the woman, but with her consent. And that's what sets it apart from rape, right? So she is a willing participant in the intimacy, but it happened outside the normal courtship that was meant to be done. And that means that there has now been loss to her, even though she went along with it.
Like promising that we'll marry after that, and oops, I changed my mind.
There are lots of different techniques that men have used over the last few thousand years. Promising to marry and then not after, saying, oh no, I'm not really going to, and then, in the midst of passion, you get consent, but really it's just caught up in the passion of consent. There are many different ways that happen that still qualify as consent, and therefore not rape, but also this is not the way intimacy is meant to work. It's not the way that a relationship is meant to work. So that's the basic category that we're dealing with. Now, if you look at the top, we'll read the quote from Exodus 22:15. If a man seduces a virgin who has not been betrothed and lies with her, he must make her his wife by payment of a bride price. If her father refuses to give her to him, he must still weigh out silver in accordance with the bride price for virgins. And they derived that the bride price is going to be that same 50 shekels that we were discussing before. So that's what we're talking about in this case. Okay, now, the seducer.
The seducer pays 3 forms of compensation and the rapist 4.
Remember how I said that in addition to the fine, there were other forms of payment for damages? This is where we're going to spell it out.
A, the seducer pays compensation for embarrassment and blemish and the fine. B, the rapist pays an additional form of compensation in that he pays for the pain. Okay,
so general Jewish tort law says that there are different types of payments in different circumstances that you have to do when you've caused damage in general to another person. And what they're saying here is that if a seducer has done what he did, then he has to pay for the embarrassment, meaning for the shame that he has caused to her. He also has to pay for the blemish, meaning for whatever diminishment there is for her. We're going to no, and he has to pay the fine, which is the 50 shekels, right? So the blemish is not the fine, right? The blemish is for which we're going to, I believe it is the next Mishnah. Or is this the one that they didn't actually explain? Trying to remember which parts I read in the Mishnah, which parts I read in the Talmud. Sometimes I get a little. Okay, no, we're gonna come back to how we get the embarrassment and how we figure out the price for the blemish. We're gonna answer that in a later Mishnah. I was right. But suffice it to say that there are 3 distinct categories that he is paying for. He is paying for the shame that he has caused her. He is paying for the damage that he has done to her. And he is paying for the bride price penalty, that fine of 50 shekels. Right? So there are 3 distinct quantities of cash that he has to pay, one of which is fixed, and the other 2 are have to be assessed by the court. But the rapist has to pay a 4th, an additional form of compensation, and that is for her pain and suffering. The actual suffering she went through for the physical act of rape. That is an additional penalty that he has to pay. Now, the reason the seducer doesn't have to pay that is because she was a willing participant. So he still hurt her, but he didn't hurt her in the painful physical way. He may have hurt her in other ways, and that's what the other compensation penalties are for. But it wasn't like he, stabbed her with a knife. Seeing how that distinction works? Right? And each of those different values, except for the fine, is assessed by the court. And we'll talk about how those get assessed in the later Mishnah.
In the comment, in the introduction, it said if a man seduces a virgin who has not been betrothed.
Right, she's not engaged to anyone.
Right, I thought if you had intercourse with someone who wasn't married, then you were now married.
So that is the later rabbinic interpretation, because the rabbis wanted to believe that every time a man had sex, he wasn't doing it just for fun. Right. Because we all know that no man would ever just sleep with a woman for fun. The only reason he'd be doing it is to get married, because you're pious. Right? That's what a good man should be. And they wanted to make that the standard in order to hold men accountable for their fun. But the Torah itself recognized that sometimes men had sex because they enjoy it, as opposed to wanting to get married. And so the rabbis do introduce that stringency that, yeah, sex is considered always to be for the purposes of marriage.
But that wasn't part of the Mishnah then?
No, well, that's part of another Mishnah, but that's not here.
But then, so how come they're not married? How come they're not married to the person he seduces?
Because it wasn't done appropriately. The Torah itself, like I said, the Torah recognizes that there are times when the guy is doing it inappropriately, and this is the penalty that happens.
So it's just prematurely that you're married.
The default position in Jewish law is that if you have sex with a woman, you are trying to get married to her.
Right.
The Torah recognizes that some men behave in a non-default manner, that they had sex with a woman and had no intention of marrying her, and in fact has walked away and is not acting like he's going to marry her. At which point, all of this kicks in, right? Because the seducer is not saying, "Wow, that was amazing. Let's get married," right? Let's continue to be together. The seducer is saying, "Wow, thank you. Don't call me. I'll call you." And the Torah is like, "No, we're not letting that happen." And the rabbis wouldn't let that happen either, which is why they're applying this and interpreting it as it needs to be interpreted. Right? But yes, if they were just willingly getting frisky before their marriage, right? Let's say they were engaged to each other, or engaged to be engaged. They were seriously dating. They absolutely planned to get married, but they just couldn't wait till the last day. The rabbis would consider them to be prematurely married. They would not consider that to be this type of seduction.
With all the rights.
Well, yeah, but you would then have to also have the ketubah and all the obligations.
And still they will have a ketubah.
You can, yes, as we now see happens. No. Because I know that nowadays it's not uncommon for bride and groom to have spent a quantity of time together with intimacy.
And including to their children also before wedding.
Yes. It's not surprising for there to be children at the chuppah from the couple. Yes.
Sorry, one last extra on that same thing. So we talked about this before, that if you actually divorced your wife and then accidentally had intercourse again, then you had to divorce her again. How come this doesn't kick in to some extent?
Because he had no intention. He was deliberately not having sex for the purpose of marriage.
Right, but when we were talking about before, I think when they said that you divorce your wife, but then...
Right, but there's a presumption of marriage
again?
Because you were married.
Oh,
right. I mean, it is your apparent precondition to be married to this woman. And you certainly should have been aware of that before you went by for, your booty call after you divorced her. Because that's not the way you're meant to behave. Right? If you divorce the woman, you're not supposed to still go by for sex.
Right. I thought this was when you behave how you're not supposed to.
It is an additional way of not behaving, but it is an additional way that happened prior to building the presumption that you would be together with her. Right? That groundwork hasn't been made here because this is happening before any of that groundwork has been laid. Okay. Part 2.
is the difference between the penalties of a seducer and those of a rapist? A, the rapist pays compensation for the pain, but the seducer does not pay compensation for the pain. B,
Keep going, yeah.
the rapist pays immediately, but the seducer pays only if he dismisses her. C, the rapist must drink out of his pot, but the seducer may dismiss the girl if he wishes.
All right, so part A is what we said at the top of the page, which is you have to you have to pay for pain if you raped. You don't have to make the payment for pain if you didn't rape. However, part B and C are new, which is to say a rapist pays the fine regardless, but the seducer only pays if he decides not to get married to her, right? If he's not going, if they decide to dismiss her, then he has to pay those additional things, because otherwise, as we've been discussing, it may have just been an overeager form of marriage that happened outside the normal channels. Part C is the one that is a little bit more idiomatic, euphemism. The rapist must drink out of his pot is basically the equivalent of saying you've made your bed, now lie in it, meaning that he does not have the option to divorce her. And we're going to talk about that more in the next Mishnah. But the seducer, on the other hand, he can divorce her, right? He didn't get married the right way, and there are certain penalties that go along with how he did it, but he is married in a more normal relationship than a rapist would be, God forbid. And therefore, if he wants to divorce her later on, he is allowed to divorce her.
One quick question. So in the case of rape, it's the girl who decides whether or not they get married, and with the seducer, it's the guy who decides whether or not they get married, right?
No, the father is also the party as well as the girl. She still has to consent.
All right, because
It's not saying it explicitly, but in all cases, a woman cannot be married against her will.
all right.
Right? That is a blanket rule of Torah.
Because before you said part of the problem here was if a guy sleeps with a girl with no intent of marrying her,
Right.
then this kicks in. But if he did have intent to marry her and sleeps with her, doesn't make him married, or does it have to be the intent of both parties?
She would have to be willing, but the idea that she was willing to sleep with him
Right.
means that she was willing to be married to him.
Right. So if he was willing to be married to her too, when they had intercourse,
Yes.
does that mean they're married?
Yes. But again, not the way that one should go about doing it. It's much better to have a chuppah.
So there's intent here a lot, right? This
Intent matters a lot, yes. But again, his reaction after the fact is what is most indicative, right? If he walks away from the relationship saying, thank you, and not, gee, let's get married, then that's where we know that there is a problem here. We're going to talk about how he can or cannot confess to what he's done. Well, maybe tonight, we'll see. But let's move on to Mishnah 3:5.
What is meant by you must drink out of his pot?
Right? What does that euphemism mean?
Even if she is lame, even she is blind, and even if she is afflicted with boils, he may not dismiss them.
All right, so this may come as a shock to you, but there are some people that get divorced from their spouse when their spouse is no longer attractive or beneficial to them. I know. Groundbreaking news. You've never heard of anything like that, right? It's never been like somebody was married to a person and then divorced them and got a trophy wife. That's never happened in all of history. It's never been somebody got sick and they didn't feel like they wanted to take care of them for the rest of their life, and so they divorced them. That's never happened. Of course, that has happened, right? It's not ideal. Those aren't behaviors that are becoming of people, but they're also behaviors that are not prohibited by law. Right? If you were married to somebody and she helped you through med school and then you get your own practice and you're doing well and you divorce her, it's not the kind of thing that makes you honored in the community, but you also have not violated halakha. You haven't broken Jewish law. However, in this case, you can't. Right? Even if she becomes the most objectionable wife to ever possibly have, there is no way for him to divorce her.
But it's not repeating the same ideas as the Mishnah 1.
You mean that he can't divorce her?
Yes.
Yeah, but it's trying
again the same and the same and the same.
Because
they don't repeat.
Because it is a point that needs deeper explanation. Because somebody might think, oh, I can't divorce her, just generally. But come on, if she's all covered in boils and hideous, you mean I have to keep being married to her? And the Mishnah is saying, yes, even then, you have to still remain married to her. Because it is so unusual that the Jewish divorce laws are generally quite permissive, meaning that you don't need great explanations for why you're divorcing. Here it has to explain that even a great explanation of why you're divorcing is not sufficient. But let's read the second half of the Mishnah before we can finish up that discussion.
She was found to have committed a licentious act
Which basically means adultery.
or was unfit to marry an Israelite, he may not continue to live with her.
Right. So if it turns out that she wasn't actually permitted to him, like she was a mamzeret or something like that, then he's not allowed to continue to live with her, but he does still remain married to her. Right. So even if
That was my question.
yeah, so even if she commits adultery, he is still not allowed to divorce her. Right? He can't live with her anymore because Jewish law says that when there's been adultery, there has to be divorce. But because of the special circumstances of how they were brought together, to use another euphemism, he is not allowed to get out of it, even if she is unfaithful to him.
So he can't remarry.
Biblically, Mishnaically, polygamy was permissible.
No, I know, but rabbinically, right?
But nowadays-
they cannot live together.
Right.
Fine, and he
Right.
still
So
supports her,
first of
but
all,
can he remarry?
in the modern world,
Yeah.
I don't know of a single community that would encourage the direct application of having the rapist marry his victim. That is simply not something that has been done for a very long time in Jewish communities. I didn't look up the actual numbers of different communities of when this was stopped, but I know that for the entire modern period,
Still happening.
in some communities it wasn't forbidden, but it generally did not happen because as we've talked about, most women would not want to be married to the rapist. And once we broke free of the economic system where you had to be tied to a man who owned the land, it gave women more options. And therefore they didn't need to be married to this guy in order to have food for the rest of her life. It wasn't as desperate of a situation. And in most of those circumstances, women were not encouraged to marry their rapist because of that. So yeah, it's been quite a long time since this was at all the common response. But this was showing you just how far the rabbis and the Torah was willing to say, you don't get to leave after you've done this.
So in that case, hypothetical and academical situation.
Well, in the days of the rabbi, it might have still happened.
So can he remarry?
You mean in the modern worlds?
No, at that time.
Yes, he wouldn't remarry.
Adultery and they don't live more together.
He would marry someone else. He would take a second wife, right, or a third, or a fourth. That was permitted in the days of the Mishnah. And
The
again,
same as her.
she couldn't have more than one husband.
No, but can she remarry?
No,
She cannot.
she cannot.
So they don't live together because she
Right.
was.
Correct. Polygamy was allowed. Polygamy was allowed, but what is it? Polyandry was not allowed, meaning that a man was allowed to have more than one wife. A woman was not allowed to have more than one
So
husband.
legally they are really completely married.
Yeah, yes,
Still married.
yes,
Legally.
just not living together. Right. Well,
But if,
like in the modern world, when we say so and such are separated, right? They're not divorced. They're still legally married. Right? If you look on their tax returns, if you look on their legal documents, they're still married, even if they have different addresses, even if they're in different countries, they're still legally married. And until they're divorced, they're married. Even people who are filing for divorce, if one of them was to die the day before the divorce was finalized, the surviving widow or widower would inherit from the deceased, even if they were in the midst of a divorce, unless the will had been changed to say otherwise. So yeah, you're not divorced until you're divorced.
aside from the men have multiple wives, but the wives don't have multiple husbands, she, in this case, we're talking about someone who was promiscuous or a harlot. In the first place, by law, she's not allowed to marry, right?
Correct. Well, no, she's allowed to marry if it's not to the guy that she was committing adultery to in this particular, if her husband died, for example. Like, let's imagine she was fooling around, it was clear, but not enough evidence to actually convict and execute her. And so they start living separately, and then her husband, her former rapist, dies. Now she is technically a widow. She is allowed to marry someone else, even though people know that she was probably fooling around. She just can't marry the guy she was fooling around with.
I thought there was something in the law about you're supposed to marry a virgin, which is to say that like someone who's like pure,
So
like someone who's not been like illegally.
my guess is what you're thinking about is to the restrictions regarding who the Kohanim can marry.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Right. And in fact, last week, 2 weeks ago,
Fresh
last week, my YouTube video was exactly on that topic. There may be a leftover handout from them of exactly what counts. So yeah, here's one.
So she
Yeah,
cannot.
pass that down. So the definition of what is a zonah, which is the term that you're referring to, is very technical when it comes to who she can marry, or who she has, or who can and cannot be classified as a zonah. But it's not just promiscuous, even though that's often how it's translated. And that was one reason why I did the class last week, because the translations are often misleading.
So she cannot marry her lover.
Correct.
Also, if he's single or divorced.
Correct. Yes. Well, because if he was single, he still committed adultery with her. Right? He is an adulterer because he slept with another man's wife. Right? Adultery just needs a married woman and a man who's not her husband. Right? If the man who's not her husband is also married, that's even worse. But the most important part for it to be adultery under Jewish law is for a married woman to have intimacy with a man not her husband. And if he's single, that's one thing. If he's married, that's a different thing. But it's her status that determines whether it's adultery or not.
So Rabbi, if she's forced to live somewhere else, that means she loses her sexual rights then, right?
She would lose her intimate rights because he's not allowed to be with her because she is an adulteress. But she would still receive her living stipend, if you will. Okay. Long intro. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to finish this tonight. We'll see. All right. 3-6.
And because she's still married to him,
Yes.
he cannot have any other relationship. She cannot have any other relationship.
She can.
No, because still will be adultery.
Exactly. You can't have more
And
adultery.
no matter if they don't live together,
Correct.
anyone that touch her will be adultery.
Correct.
And there will be a death penalty.
Yes.
It's not a good deal for her. from the beginning.
Correct. But so this is one of the cases in the Torah where the Torah is trying to fix a tragedy that's already happened as best as it could within the economy of the ancient world. Right? I mean, the same thing happens when we talk about a captive woman from the case of a war situation. Right? It's not saying that the Torah is not saying you should take a captive. It's saying if you do this thing which is not good, this is how you should treat her, which is as a wife rather than as a concubine. And this is also saying if you do this thing that's not good, like raping a woman, this is how you should treat her, which isn't great, but it's better than how you were planning to treat her. And it's better than she would be left on her own unless her family community was able to give better, at which point she can say, get lost, but make sure you pay all the damage that you did.
What's the penalty for having intercourse with a forbidden wife?
Meaning
If she's forbidden to you, but she's still your wife.
Flogging. Yeah, you get lashed. Now, an interesting comparison for the modern world would be in the modern court, we do not consider rape to be a civil case. We consider rape to be a criminal case. So if a man rapes a woman, his penalty is various degrees of going to prison. She receives nothing. Right? She doesn't get paid at all. She doesn't get paid for damages. She doesn't get paid for anything else. If he walked up to her and punched her in the face, he would have to pay her, right? For physical abuse, right? If he broke their car window, he'd have to pay her. If he rapes her, he doesn't pay her. Now he's only in the criminal court.
That's interesting. It's true. If you see it were a lawyer, can you explain that?
I think they can make him pay. Well, they can get a court order saying you got to pay her. I think.
I believe that you can go to civil court and sue for a violation of civil rights and things like that, but it is not built in to the penalty of being a rapist.
Yeah,
right?
Just restitution, I think.
Right. That is an additional a court proceeding that a person would have to engage in as an individual litigant, rather than the state versus Mr. Rapist. It would have to be victim versus Mr. Rapist. And, I think most people don't go through that process. And I don't think we have basic guidelines laid out for exactly how that gets handled. Unlike the Torah, which says, look, the crime was done to her, she needs to be compensated. Not the crime was done to her, he needs to be punished. So this may sound archaic, but let's realize that it's not as though we're living in some perfect utopian system where the justice makes a lot more sense. There are still big problems. I do think, however, putting him in prison and giving her the fine, that makes a lot more sense to me. But that we don't have that particular situation in either settings. 3-6, a short one. What's that? That's you, yes.
So, if an orphan was betrothed and then divorced, Rabbi Lezer says the seducer is exempt, but the violator is lying.
Okay, so what's the issue here? What's the orphan doing in this conversation?
Because she doesn't have a father.
Right, there's no papa, right? So there's no father, so where do I pay and who do I have to pay and how does this work?
So what is seducer exempt? Still is the same crime.
But there was no crime against the broader family, right? There was only a crime against her and she went along with it. She was willing. Now, we can say maybe she shouldn't have been willing. And certainly we have to realize that if the rabbis had a situation like the modern world where somebody could get her drunk and so she wasn't aware of what was happening, or she's passed out, or using, Rohypnol or other drugs to seduce, that's absolutely called rape. That's not, seduction. Seduction means she gave consent. But if she was in a family setting, and we're going to talk about the timeline, which is going to really figure prominently into her age and maybe make you rethink how we've been doing all of this, then that was not just against her, it was also disrupting the entire family. And that's why Rabbi Elazar is making a distinction here.
It makes sense also.
Okay, 3-7, we're chugging along.
How is the compensation that is paid for? How's the compensation that's paid for embarrassment reckoned?
Okay, how do we figure out how much we have to pay for the shame of what happened?
It all depends on the status of the offender and the offended.
Okay, so welcome to the pre-modern world where social status mattered. And by the way, it still does matter, we just pretend like it doesn't. Okay, so you have somebody from the upper strata of society raped by someone from the lower status of society. The shame of that rape is considered larger, and therefore the payoff is considered larger. If you reverse their roles, where you have someone from the upper status of society raping someone from the lower status of society, the shame is not considered to be as great. Now, that's not the only measure. The particulars of each person, the person who was doing the crime and the person to whom the crime was done, can also figure into this in terms of their overall status and standing in the community. So if the upper class person is known as being a horrible, horrible person, that changes the balance as well, especially if the lower class person is considered to be a generally good or upright person, apart from the rape. That also changes. I mean, if they were the rapist, or on the other hand, if they were the victim, but known for being good, even if they came from a lower strata, all of that can change the calculation. But there was considered to be a relative scale that you could say, this person raping that person is a bigger shame than this person raping a different person. Now, in the modern world, we recoil at that. However, that is not the way we actually handle our law. Right? Mr. Lawyer, you may know this sort of thing, but if I run over a corporate lawyer, I am likely to pay a much heavier fine to his family than if I run over a homeless man.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Goes by potential earnings.
Exactly right. It goes by potential earnings, which is going to make the next part of it.
In proportion. Maybe $100 for the homeless, it represents like $1,000 or $10,000 for the.
That is not the way our courts handle it.
It's all about proportion.
That is not the way our courts handle it. Right? And in fact, that's going to make the next part of this Mishnah a little bit more acceptable. Onward.
How is the compensation that's paid for blemish rate?
Remember, blemish is the actual physical damage done to her. Not the pain or suffering that came with it, but the lasting damage that was done. In this case, the largest portion of lasting damage that was done to her is the removal of her physical virginity. Right? She is no longer physically a virgin. She has been wounded, if you will, in that particular way. And she may have also been wounded in other ways as well during the rape.
She is regarded as if she were a slave to be sold in the marketplace. It's estimated how much she was worth then, how much she is worth now.
Right? So before she was raped, if she was up on the block, someone would have paid X for her. Now that she's been raped and has been physically damaged in this particular way, again, we're not talking about shame or societal stigma or anything like that. We're talking about actual physical wound. She's worth X minus something. And whatever that difference is between how much she's worth now and how much she used to be worth, that's how much he has to pay for the blemish. So he has to pay for the shame, he has to pay for the blemish, and he has to pay for the pain, and he has to pay the fine. So those are how the different components are estimated.
And if he doesn't have the money, he needs to go as a slave.
He can, there's a couple different things. He can take out a loan and then pay it back, or he can sell himself as an indentured servant, and then that money is given to her. I mean, he sells himself, so there's a quantity of cash, and then that's given. Yes. So again, coming back to American law, in case you think, oh, slave, it sounds so horrible, right? Same thing. We measure earning potential for most of these types of damage. If I cut off the hand of a neurosurgeon, I'm going to have to pay a lot more in damage than if I cut off the hand for someone who
Manual.
What's that?
Manual labor.
No, manual laborer, right? A waiter, right? A waiter would not have earned as much with that hand. Therefore, I don't have to pay as much for that hand. And if I cut off, a pinky, even if it's my treasured pinky, I love this pinky, it doesn't matter what it means to you, it's probably a negligible loss, and therefore the payment for the actual wound is going to be negligible. For the pain, it may be huge. For the embarrassment and shame of the damage, it may be huge. But the actual loss of physical ability is minor. That part of the settlement is going to be much less. That makes sense? Part 3.
The fine is the same for all.
Right? Meaning the fine, on the other hand, is flat, is fixed. Right? So it doesn't matter social standing. It doesn't matter whether you left a wound or didn't leave a wound. You could have been, as gentle as possible, if you can even call rape gentle, and have no blemish. That doesn't matter. The fine is the fine. Right? In that, everybody is equal. Good. And
any sum that is fixed in the Torah remains the same for all.
Right. So we get a general rule, which reminds us that if you have a fixed sum in the Torah, any place the Torah says X shekels or X amount, that is always universally applied. That never is adjustable. That never goes up. It never goes down, depending upon any other variables. It is what it is.
What about inflation?
What about what?
Silver hedges against inflation.
About inflation. Yeah, the rabbis do take care of what they believe the value of it is in their own community. So they do apply that number, but that number is, once fixed for their current situation, is applied universally in all applications.
They didn't have inflation.
Of course they did. And in fact,
Did it say silver shekels though? Isn't the silver a hedge against inflation?
no, I mean, there was absolutely inflation back in those days. In fact, there was both inflation and deflation. It was said very powerfully during after the fall of Bar Kokhba from the second Jewish revolt in 136, that there were so many Jews taken and sold as a slave that the price of slaves just fell through the floor. Right? And there was also another.
That's not inflation, it's just
That's deflation, right? Each slave was worth less.
I thought that's just more supply of
Supply and demand,
demand.
I suppose.
Actually, some way was positive. So less people would go to slavery.
No, because it just meant you could buy more slaves for fewer coins.
Wow.
Yeah, it was not a good time in Jewish history. All right. Are people willing to press on, but it means doing it quickly, or should we save the last 2 Mishnayot for next week?
I keep going.
We can go.
We're ready for just, we've got another 5-10 minutes maybe?
I speak for myself, I don't know, everybody.
All right, I don't see anyone looking for the door. Let's Pound it out. 3-8.
Wherever there is the right of sale, there is a fine, and wherever there is a fine, there is no right of sale.
Okay. Ready for the next offensive ancient point? There was a special time in a young girl's life when her father could sell her as a servant if necessary. Right? And she had to be what was known as a ketana, as a minor. And whenever she was in that status, then there would be.
You said she had to be a minor?
She had to be a minor. Once she reached the age of majority, which is what the rest of this Mishnah is going to lay out for us, is those different ages, then he could no longer have that right. So she had to be a minor in order for her to be eligible for him to sell her. Now, again, this was a form of indentured servitude, and this was not a form of concubinage, meaning that the person she was being sold to was not meant to use her sexually. She was just going to be a servant in this circumstance.
And when she become to be bat mitzvah, she need to return to the house, or she need to continue being a servant until.
I don't remember the details of what happens when she reaches the age of majority, but that would probably be contingent on the sale. Now, she could always be hired out as a servant at a later age, but she wouldn't be in that indentured servitude category. So, while she is young enough to still be, in quote, sold, the penalty is not to make a fine because she's not old enough to then get married. On the other hand, as soon as she is old enough to get married, then the fine kicks in, and she is now no longer eligible for being sold as a servant. That's what that first sentence is trying to tell us.
So I need to pay the 50 shekels.
Exactly. So let's do the 3 different categories that the rabbis are going to tell us. So we got 3 different age categories. Aaron, if you would keep reading.
In the case of a minor, there is the right of sale and there is no fine.
Okay, so a minor, the kitana is less than 12. Right? If she is under 12, she is considered to be a minor. And if she is a minor, then there is the right of sale. Their father could sell her to be an indentured servant, but that would not. But if she were raped at that age, there wouldn't be the fine because she wouldn't be eligible for marriage. All the other penalties would still be there, but there wouldn't be the fine that we talked about. On the other hand,
in the case of a young woman, there is no fine.
No, there is a fine.
There is a fine, but no right of sale.
Okay, so the young woman is, we're going to use the Hebrew letters, well, the Hebrew letters in English, right? The ketana is under 12. The na'ara is more than 12 and less than 12 plus 6 months. But 12 here is also with puberty. Right? So once she hits puberty, once that begins to happen, she is considered a na'ara, a young girl, a young woman. How do they call it? Young woman. Once she is a young woman, that process can only last for 6 months under Jewish law. Legally.
And what happens if she started at 11 in puberty?
So if puberty starts earlier, then she becomes a na'ara earlier.
Really?
Yeah. Right. If her puberty begins early, again, this is under technical Jewish law. It's not how it is often applied in most of the world for the last 1,500 years. Right. But yes, technically, puberty is required for maturity. And if she goes into puberty at 9, she is technically considered to be a na'ara. And then after 6 months, she is considered to be a bulgaret, which is a woman, a mature, an adult, physically at least. And that also means if it was delayed, that is also the case. The rabbis, however, did not want us to keep having to check for the physical signs of puberty, in particular the growing of hair in those places. And so they set as a limit 12 for girls, 13 for boys, and then the 6 months coming right after that. And it was assumed that puberty was happening at that point, and we weren't checking. That make sense?
So that was instead of checking.
Instead of looking for the hairs.
But what happens if that doesn't work? That she has poor candidate. The rabbi knows. So what happens in that case?
So
we work that by that or by?
In the days of the Mishnah, yes, she would go whenever she went into puberty. And nowadays, we don't check, and therefore, I don't know. Right? So I would not count an 11-year-old in the minyan, even if I suspected that she had gone through puberty, even though I will count an adult woman in minyan.
How do they establish that you're pubescent? What do they do to check?
In the ancient world, it was 2 hairs. You have begun puberty when you have 2 hairs in your genitals.
Well, what if you get 2 hairs on like your leg or your armpit? That don't count?
Nope. Nope. That was specifically in that zone. That was considered the most reliable.
Everywhere else.
It was possible, but the average was that was the area that the indication of puberty was most reliable, most consistent across the population.
What do you mean they would check?
I mean, in the ancient world, the family would see each other at different times disrobed. That was normal, right? The idea that no family member would ever see another family member without their clothes on is a fairly modern idea. Back then, it wasn't unusual when someone was bathing or swimming or something like that to see from time to time a person.
They live very close to each other.
Usually in a one-room house.
Yes, one-room house.
So it wasn't impossible to see the other person. Now, there were certain people you weren't supposed to see. So, you weren't supposed to be looking at your mom while she's naked and things like that. But the children were usually observed by the parents as they developed. That was just normal of making sure that they were developing healthily. The same way that nowadays most people have no problem with the idea that a doctor is checking out children to make sure they're developing healthily. We had no doctors back then. Each family did it for themselves. But yeah, nowadays that's not the way we handle it. And don't let any rabbi ever tell you that is what he's doing. That is not allowed. You laugh, but there have been so many cases of sex offenders, even within the rabbinate, that no.
In New York last year.
More recently than that, but thankfully we don't get all the news, but some of it unfortunately is hushed up, and then it comes out years later. It's not good. Anyway, let's move on to happier topics. The case of the Bogeret.
In the case of a girl who reached majority age, there is no right of sale and there is no fine.
All right. Once she reaches my math sign. She is greater than 12 years plus 6 months, right? Once she has gotten over that, she can't be sold into indentured servitude, and there is no fine being paid to her father. She is now considered to be her own adult. And that means that she is now in her own status, right? It's not going
to receive the money.
Exactly. It's not going to debt.
So it says there's no fine. There's a fine, but it's just not going to the father.
The Talmud explains that there still is a fine, but it's not going to the father. It's one of those places where the Talmud helps us understand the Mishnah, which helps us understand the Torah. All right. Last one, which is all of a general pattern. Hopefully we can finish this without too much delay.
He who declares, I seduced the daughter of so-and-so must pay compensation for embarrassment and blemish on his own admission, but need not pay the fine. Okay, so what we're basically going to see in a pattern here of if someone admits their guilt before any evidence was brought, before any witnesses were there, but actually says, I did this, then they don't have to pay the extrajudicial penalties. They have to pay the primary penalties. They have to pay the fee for damages, basically, but they don't have to pay the bonus penalty. So this is, of course, intended to encourage people to actually admit the guilt of what they did. Again, they have to pay all the penalties that are inherent in the action they did. They only are escaping the penalty that comes from what would have been the cover-up, if you will. And we're going to see some...
But that's not paid the fine.
Right,
so
the 50 shekels.
That he doesn't pay is the 50 shekels.
Exactly. He pays everything except the 50 shekels.
I don't know if this is actually a difference. I know she used the word penalty and they used the word compensation. You must pay compensation.
So right, the compensation here is money.
Right.
So if it's a penalty that happens to be money, we often call that a compensation. That's just English synonyms.
Right. Because in law, I mean, penalty means punitive, is meant to punish.
Yeah, penalty could be lots of different forms, right? It could be a penalty by being flogged. It could be a penalty by have people throw eggs at you.
But compensation usually means to make whole.
And that's why this text is being a little bit more.
Is that in Jewish law too, or?
Well, there's no.
I mean,
there's a term for fine.
Right.
Right. There's a term for actual fine. So, and that's the term that's used here in the Hebrew.
Oh, the fine term?
Yes.
Wow.
Okay. Part 2.
He who declares I've not stolen.
I have stolen.
He who declares I have stolen must make restitution for the principal on his own evidence, but do not repay double, fourfold, or fivefold.
Right. Depending upon what you stole and whether you ate it or otherwise have destroyed it, you will usually have to pay multiples of whatever it is what you stole. But on the other hand, as soon as you've stolen, if you turn around and walk back in and say, oh my God, I stole it, all you have to do is repay the actual value of what you stole. Right? But if you don't, and someone catches you, then all of the additional penalty kicks in. So if I steal your sheep, I take it back to my home and I'm sharpening up my knife, getting ready to eat it. If I eat it, I'm paying multiple folds when I have to return the money to you. But if I stop, walk back over to your house and say, here's your sheep, I'm sorry I took it, all I have to do is return the sheep. And as long as it's in good shape, we're okay. Right? If it's damaged, I have to pay the difference, of course, for whatever the damage is to it. Part 3.
He who declares my ox has killed so-and-so, or the ox of so-and-so, must make restitution on his own evidence.
Well, wait a minute. My ox killed so-and-so. I have to make restitution. I don't seem to be getting any benefit here. And that's because there isn't an extrajudicial penalty for what you did. There is only the primary penalty, the primary compensation, which is if you killed so-and-so with your ox, you are liable for the damage that you caused to happen. And if you willfully let the ox kill the person, then you could even be included, that could even include the death penalty. So you can't confess your way out of all punishment. They're only the primary punishment in these cases. Part A.
So it's only what the ox broke, right?
But it's right. But what the ox, well, this is actually for the ox killing something else, right? The ox kills another cow, right? So that, or the ox kills another person, then you have to pay for that damage.
So yeah, in this way you avoid the death penalty for you.
No, you don't avoid anything in this case. When you confess that your ox killed somebody else's cow, you're not getting out of any additional penalty.
There is no real.
There's no benefit to confessing in this case.
So it doesn't work.
Well, it works because you should confess, and you do tshuva, and spiritually it's important. But as far as the legal penalty goes, no, you're not gaining anything by confessing, because there was nothing additionally punitive to what happened. Right? If I run over your dog, I just have to pay you for the dog. If my cow kills your cow, I just have to pay you for the cow. So there's nothing for me to escape other than paying for what I did, and I have to pay for what I did, no matter how much I was eager to confess. Part A.
If he said, my ox killed the slave of so-and-so, he need not make restitution on his own.
Right, so there was a special penalty that came along to the slave owner for the death of the slave, which was a fixed fee of 30 shekels, and that is what is being forgiven in this case. Right? If you confess, you don't have to pay the bonus penalty for the death of the slave. And then part 4, we get a general summation.
This is the general rule. Whoever pays more than the actual cost of the damage he has done, or whoever pays more than the actual cost of the damage he has done, need not pay it on his own evidence.
Right, so if I'm the only person testifying about this, if I tell you I did it, I have to pay my damages, but I don't have to pay any additional fine or penalty. And then we're good. So confession is good.
What does it say pays more than the actual cost of damages?
Because there's the actual damage I've caused. I stole this item. I killed this cow, right? That's what I need to repay you for.
Why does it say the more, though, whoever pays more than?
Because like it's lessening how much you have to pay if you confess that you did it.
I thought that was a typo.
No. What it's trying to say is that in some cases, you do have to pay more than the actual damage, right? If I stole your sheep and I ate it, I'm paying more than the actual damage to you. In those cases, if I confess, I only have to pay the actual damage.
Oh, all right.
right? So it's in a case, it should be in English, we might say, in a case where a person would pay more than the actual cost of the damage he has done, he need not pay it on his own evidence. Does that make it clearer?
Yes, that makes it completely clear now.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, and that's the joy of Mishnah language, which this translation helps even more. If you look at a Hebrew edition of this, you'll see that the Mishnah is usually about half as many words as we have on our page, because the Mishnah speaks in very, very short technical sentence style. And you should be very grateful that we have more words, because the few words of the Mishnah were easy to memorize, hard to unpack. And we will leave it there for tonight.
So we can-
Yeah.